Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing Libya and its fragile political, economic, and social state. Joining me from Los Angeles is Omar Turbi. He's the founder of the Libyan Human Rights Commission and persuaded the U.S. government to participate in the NATO operation in Libya. From Detroit, we have Abayomi Azikiwe. He's the editor of Pan-African Newswire, and a frequent TV commentator on African issues. And here with me in Washington is Lawrence Korb. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here today. Before we start, I'd like to get your reaction to President Obama's comments in 2011 after the NATO operation in Libya, and I'd like to ask you some questions after we listen. So let's listen to that first.
In just 1 month, the United States has worked with our international partners to mobilize a broad coalition, secure an international mandate to protect civilians, stop an advancing army, prevent a massacre, and establish a no-fly zone with our allies and partners. So for those who doubted our capacity to carry out this operation, I want to be clear. The United States of America has done what we said we would do.
So, Abayomi, I'm going to start with you. In retrospect, was U.S. action in Libya the right one?
No, it was not, and I was never in favor of the United States Pentagon, Central Intelligence Agency, and NATO operations against Libya. It's been an unmitigated disaster. Before the U.S. destabilization-led program against Libya, it had the highest standard of living of any other country on the African continent. There was no evidence of the type of gross human rights violations that were alleged by elements within the United States government, largely out of the State Department. And of course, what we see in Libya today is a direct result of the failure of the Obama administration policy towards that North African state. Today, it is a fractured country. It has declined economically. It is in a situation right now where it is a source of instability, not only within Libyan borders, but also throughout the entire region of North, as well as West Africa. This is a general consensus on a part of NATO.
Well, thank you for having me on. Abayomi obviously has not had much history of Libya and is not really aware of the timing and the years prior to the build-up to over Britain, France, England. So one mistake, or I should say it's a big mistake, of the United States and the Western world is they had not anticipated the chaos following the fall of the Gaddafi regime. NATO announced in 2011 that their military operations at the end of October 2011 will, although they tried to bring in, the Western nations tried to bring in some non-government organizations to help construct and build institutions in Libya, but they fell short in following through all the way and in working with the transitional government, working with Libyan people to get their institutions up and running.
Let me go to you, Lawrence. Is Libya better off today than it was during Gaddafi's reign?
Oh, very definitely. As just been pointed out, Gaddafi would have done anything. It was a U.S.-inspired uprising against Gaddafi, and he would have done anything to stay in power, regardless of how many people that he killed. And I think it's important to keep in mind, this was not a U.S.-led operation. In fact, President, quote-unquote, leading from behind, if you remember that we only did about 25% of the actual attacks. And it wasn't just NATO. You had the Arab League was involved, the UN supported it. Where I agree is we should have thought, okay, what comes next? And the international community should have done like we did in the Balkans. I mean, we still have forces on the ground in the Balkans after we got rid of another dictator, Milosevic back there in the mid-90s.
So, Lawrence, what should the international community be doing right now? The country is in complete chaos. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of different militias armed militias fighting for the control of this country?
Well, I think what you need to do is, again, you have to have a UN or a NATO peacekeeping force has to go in there until you can get the situation under control. But, you know, the great irony is when a country like the United States or other Western goes into a different culture to try and help them, as we've tried, for example, in Afghanistan, basically we get resented as outsiders trying to, you know, impose order. That's why I think it would be good if you had the African Union take the lead in quelling the violence there.
So Abayomi, let me go with you to you. Why hasn't the African Union taken the lead?
Well, first of all, the African Union in 2011 developed a program for the peaceful resolution of the internal conflict in Libya. This was totally ignored by the United States and its NATO allies, as well as the opposition forces inside of Libya itself. If you look at the carrying out of the war against Libya, there were some 30,000 sorties that were flown over the country. There were some 10,000 airstrikes. It has been estimated that anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people were killed in that operation. Several million people were displaced. And to even suggest that Libya had no national institutions under the Jamahiriya is totally false. I mean, there were millions of guest workers inside the country laboring in the areas of construction, in the medical fields, the technological developments that had taken place in Libya over the time period between the 1970s and the time of the overthrow. The construction of the great man-made river, the investments into other African states by the Libyan government, and Libya was at one point chairperson of the African Union. So to suggest that the United States and NATO is not responsible for the chaos that's going on in Libya now is a total misrepresentation of the actual situation inside the country. So I don't think a United Nations peacekeeping force is a solution unless the Libyan people themselves can organize and form some type of national unity government that is viable. There is really no hope in terms of stabilizing the political situation inside the country. It goes without saying that the country now, as a result of the actions of the United States and the NATO Secretary General Andres Rasmussen said in the aftermath of the bombing in late 2011 that if it had not been for the leading role of the United States in carrying out this massive bombing campaign for 8.5 months, that it would not have been successful in overthrowing the government and in assassinating Muammar Gaddafi. So the United States, the Western countries, and those who supported this intervention, as well as other interventions. Because if we look at Afghanistan, if we look at Syria, if we look at Somalia, all of these states in which the United States has intervened over the last 13 years has prompted the largest humanitarian crisis internationally since World War II. The United Nations Refugee Agency released a report 2 weeks ago saying that the wars in Afghanistan, in Syria, and in Somalia, all of which are a direct result of U.S. foreign policy, has prompted the worst incidents of displacement and refugee status since World War II. Some 51 million people are displaced right now around the world.
Clearly, the refugee crisis is another problem that this crisis and other conflicts around the world have created. But I really want to focus on Libya here. And Omar, let me turn to you. Isn't part of the problem in Libya is even if an African Union or some other organization wanted to go in and negotiate, who would they be negotiating with? There is no specific leader, and then you have all these rampant factions running around the country. Isn't that one of the big problems here?
The proposition to have the African Union do anything in Libya is hysterical to me, because they have all kinds of problems in Africa that they're not able to solve on their own. But
well, Libya is in Africa too.
What about the Arab League?
And same thing, if the Arab League is able to solve any problems, they would have been able to make some recommendations or do something about what's going on in Iraq or Syria or Yemen or Libya for that matter. So frankly, I think what needs to be done is to have the United Nations organ take the lead. And unfortunately, the United Nations doesn't really act or become very effective unless the powerful Security Council nations like the United States, France, Britain, and also China and Russia are the the 5 permanent members of the Security Council push for a plan.
Here, I would like to get Lawrence's take on this. Do you agree with what Omar is saying about UN's involvement?
Oh, very definitely. It's got to be the international community to do it. It can't be the United States. And as I mentioned, President Obama was criticized for not doing more during the military campaign. We did provide the intelligence that helped the other nations, but you had people, armed forces, pilots from planes from Qatar over there, flying. And I think, again, I'm sure that the United States, France, and the United Kingdom would vote for it. The real question would China and Russia. They did abstain initially, and they felt that they had been taken advantage of because they never thought that the operation would go so far, and then they wouldn't do anything about Syria. So I would hope that China and Russia would see this humanitarian crisis and be willing to get the UN involved.
Well, we'll leave it at that.
I totally agree with that. Let me make a point here. It's very, very important for China and Russia to take a proactive role in supporting Western nations in implementing good and viable steps to improve the situation in Libya. It's in their own best interest. It's not like an East and West camp. I think it would be very important for China and Russia to help in this crisis.
Thank you so much, Omar Turbi, Abayomi Azikiwe, and with me here in Washington, Lawrence Korb. Thank you so much. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We would love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And you can now listen to CCTV America programs 24/7 from anywhere in the United States by simply calling 231-460-1199. I'm Asiye Namdar in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.